Good afternoon. A quorum being present, I call this hearing to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We have a number of members participating remotely today. Before we proceed, I would like to go over some items for our members participating remotely. First, if you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. Members participating remotely must continue to use the video function for the duration of their participation in the hearing unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render the member unable to fully participate on camera. It is committee and subcommittee policy that members participating remotely will remain muted when not recognized, just as turning your microphone on and off during an in-person hearing. This is out of courtesy to all members on the committee and so that background noise does not interfere with another member who is recognized to speak. When you are recognized, you will need to unmute your microphone and pause for 2 to 3 seconds before speaking to ensure everything you say is captured on the live stream. If you wish to be recognized, please unmute your microphone and ask to be recognized. If you wish to have a document inserted in the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the document to veteransaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. It will be uploaded to the committee document repository. Please keep in mind that you will need to refresh the repository page as it does not automatically update. Without objection, members will be recognized in order of committee seniority for questioning witnesses today. This will make it easier for me to ensure all members participating have an opportunity to be recognized. Does any member have a question about the conduct of this hearing with members participating remotely? I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'm pleased to host today's hearings to discuss the 8 bills on the agenda, and I'm looking forward to hearing testimony from our witnesses. The bills we'll consider today help improve the quality of VA benefit decisions, create equity and burial benefits, and provide additional legal assistance to veterans in need. Introduced by our own committee member, Representative Allred, the Veterans Claim Transparency Act reinstates the historic privilege given to veteran service organizations to review VA decision ratings 48 hours before they are made final, referred to as the 48-hour rule. VSOs have long been allowed to review veterans' claims files for accuracy, saving time for the veterans and for the VA by avoiding errors in finalized VA decisions. In April of this year, VA revoked this privilege, citing the need for expediency in issuing decisions and their new appeals process, which allows for easier, quicker correction of decisions after they are issued. But our VSO partners came to us to express a strong desire to have this privilege reinstated. Mr. Allred's bill not only reinstates the 48-hour review for VSOs, it allows other veterans representatives, such as attorneys and agents, to take advantage of the opportunity as well. Of the other bills we will receive testimony on today, many create equal access for burial benefits, which will be particularly helpful for rural and tribal veterans. For example, Mr. Sablan's Veteran Cemetery Grants Improvement Act will expand VA's current grant program for veteran cemeteries run by a state, tribal organization, or territory. Mr. Sablan's bill allows VA to provide additional funds for maintenance of these veteran cemeteries. Similarly, the Fairness for Local Veteran Cemeteries Act also makes an adjustment to VA's cemeteries grant program by allowing counties to apply for these grants where there is no state's veteran cemetery. Representative Delgado's bill will be particularly beneficial for the 4 states, Alaska, Oregon, Florida, and New York, that do not have state-run veteran cemeteries and can increase access to burial for veterans. Given that cremations are becoming more favorable in comparison to traditional burials, there is a population of veterans that aren't able to be memorialized through a VA-furnished headstone or marker if these choose not to be interred at a veteran's cemetery. The Osher Burial Benefits Act is a bipartisan bill to authorize VA to furnish an urn or a plaque in lieu of a headstone or marker if a veteran's cremains were not interred in a VA cemetery, or if their family wishes to keep the cremains. In addition to these cemetery bills, we are hearing testimony on the Veterans Legal Support Act of 2019. This bill allows the VA to provide funding to university law school programs and clinics that provide pro bono assistance to veterans in need. Programs and clinics like these are important because they not only help veterans navigate the claims process at VA, they also provide support on a variety of legal services on a pro bono basis. And I will note that there is a very successful program like this at William and Mary University, which is located in my district in Virginia. I want to thank everyone for being here today. We look forward to hearing your testimonies. I will now turn it over to Ranking Member Bost for his opening comments. Mr. Bost, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Luria. And I want to thank you all for joining us here today to discuss some important pieces of legislation pending before the subcommittee. The bills on today's agenda are intended to address the issues that are very important to veterans and their families. First, I'm proud to sponsor of H.R. 6013, the Veterans Families Financial Support Act, which is on today's agenda. I introduced this bipartisan legislation with Representative Rice, and I appreciate her leadership on the issue. H.R. 6013 would modernize the Service Disability Veterans Insurance, or the SDVI program. In 1951, Congress created the SDVI program to meet the needs of wounded Korean War veterans. Unfortunately, due to their service connection disabilities, many Korean War veterans were not eligible for private life insurance. The SDVI program ensured that those veterans could receive up to $10,000 of life insurance coverage from the VA. While $10,000 may have been sufficient coverage for veterans in 1950s, I have heard concerns that the program is not meeting those needs today. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, in 2019, families can expect to pay over $9,000 for funeral costs on average. This leaves family members uninsured from the SDVI program while only having about $1,000 to cover other expenses such as cemetery fees, outstanding medical bills, and other end-of-life experiences. So, no one wants to worry, when they leave a burden and don't want to leave a burden to their families, so simply because they have passed on. Veterans should have a peace of mind that their families will not incur personal debt just to provide their loved ones with a dignified funeral and burial, and to settle any outstanding accounts. Clearly, $10,000 is not enough. H.R. 6013 would provide veterans with assurance that their families will be taken care of financially by raising the maximum SDVI coverage to $40,000. Moreover, many service disabled veterans cannot take advantage of the current SDVI program. Currently, veterans can be denied SDVI coverage if they have a non-service connected disability. H.R. 6013 would guarantee the veterans cannot be denied SDVI coverage for a pre-existing health condition. Furthermore, veterans are required to apply for the SDVI coverage within 2 years of receiving an award of service connection for a condition. Understandably, veterans may be focused on adjusting to their life with a new disability and not even be aware that the SDVI program exists, and by the time the veteran learns about the insurance, it may be too late. My bill would address the issue by removing 2-year time limit to apply. Instead, veterans would be subject to a 2-year waiting period under the new program. During the waiting period, veterans could pay premiums for 2 years before they are vested in the program. However, if the veteran passes away during the wait period, the family would receive the premiums paid plus interest. The 2 years waiting period allows VA to manage the financial risk of the program, and there is no financial risk to the veteran because the payments would be returned to the family. In the FY18 Congress, subsidized about half of the SDVI program through a $73 million appropriation. Under the modernized program, premiums would cover the long-term cost of the program. This would bring the SDVI program in line with the majority of the VA's other life insurance programs, which are self-funded. Once the modernization program goes into effect, the outdated SDVI program would be sunset. Veterans insured under SDVI would then have 2 years to opt in to the modernization program, but only if they choose to do so. I appreciate the letters of support for H.R. 6013 that I received from the VFW and the Wounded Warrior projects. And Madam Chair, I would like to enter them into the record and ask unanimous consent to enter in the record.
You have unanimous consent.
Thank you. Today, we will also discuss two bills introduced by my colleagues on the committee. Representative Banks will have H.R. 697, would allow the VA to pay certain burial transportation costs for families who choose to lay their loved ones at rest at state or tribal veteran cemeteries. H.R. 6060, which is introduced by Representative Watkins, would also allow VA to provide an outer burial receptacle for veterans who are interested in state or tribal veteran cemeteries. Both bills seek to bring parity among the nation's cemeteries and VA grant-funded state, tribal, and cemeteries. Now, although Representative Banks will not be testified today, I appreciate the statement that he has sent in for the record. I know many of my colleagues here today have worked hard on their proposals. I look forward to having the discussion. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bost. For the first panel, we will hear testimony from the members who introduced legislation on the agenda today. First, we have three members from this subcommittee presenting testimony on their bills. Representative Sablan from the Northern Marianas Islands, Mr. Allred of Texas, and Mr. Watkins of Kansas. Welcome to you all. Without objection, several of our other colleagues will join us for today's hearing. Mr. Brindisi of New York, who sits on the Economic Opportunity and Health Subcommittees, Mr. Delgado, also of New York, and Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia. With that, I now recognize Mr. Sablan for 5 minutes. Correction, for 3 minutes.
He's not muted, or he's muted.
Mr. Sablan, can you please verify that you are unmuted?
There we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Is that good?
Yep.
Yes, Mr. Sablan, you're
All right,
recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Luria, Ranking Member Boss, members of the subcommittee. Good afternoon, your time. Good morning, your tomorrow, where I'm right now. Man, thank you also for your leadership, for supporting our veterans, and for including on today's agenda H.R. 5487, the Veteran Cemetery Grants Improvement Act. This bill will help get more funding for operations and maintenance to locally owned veteran cemeteries nationwide. It increases from $5 million to $10 million the VA can grant for this purpose each year. And as more veterans choose to be buried close to their home, more states, territories, and tribal governments are applying for funding from the VA to help cover the cost of operating, maintaining local veteran cemeteries. And while the list of application grows, the amount the department can award has not. So under current law, no more than $5 million can be awarded per year to meet the needs of over 100 cemeteries. The Veteran Cemetery Grants Improvement Act updates that authorization by a modest $5 million. The act will help veteran cemeteries in every state, territory, and tribal nation remain the dignified and well-maintained resting places our veterans deserve. And I know in my own district, the Mariana Islands, the veteran cemetery built with federal funds faces challenges in this respect. Veteran families have come to me for help, and this bill responds. And I know my co-sponsor, Representative Doyle, shares this concern for the Southern Wisconsin Veterans Memorial Cemetery in his district, as do other members for the cemeteries that serve their constituents, as both the chair and the ranking member have just spoken to. I know the members of this subcommittee are committed to honoring our nation's veterans and their families who have sacrificed so much to ensure our country remains safe and we remain free. I want to thank the veterans of foreign wars, American Legion, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and Wounded Warrior Project for endorsing my legislation. I ask unanimous consent that their comments be entered into the record.
Without objection, the documents you
I
offered.
want to also note that the Veterans Administration support this legislation. And so I urge the subcommittee to favorably report H.R. 5487, the Veteran Cemetery Grants Improvement Act. I thank the chair and the ranking and all of you for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan. Mr. Allred, you are now recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Bost, for holding today's hearing and considering my bill, the Veterans Claim Transparency Act, H.R. 7443. Earlier this month, I introduced this bipartisan bill with Congressman Jim Hagedorn in response to the decision to eliminate the 48-hour review policy in the midst of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. My bill is a common sense measure that reinstates and codifies the 48-hour review process and extends this practice to attorney advocates representing veterans. The 48-hour review policy was an essential practice that had been in place for years. This policy allows VSOs, veteran service organizations, to review a preliminary determination of a veteran's benefits before the VA finalizes the determination. This review period is an extra check on the accuracy of benefit determinations. And during this period, VSOs can help identify technical mistakes and errors that can affect a veteran's benefit. Reinstating this policy, particularly in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, is a simple step that can help make sure that our veterans get the benefits they're owed. Improving claims accuracy on the front end helps veterans avoid delays in receiving their benefits or having to go through a lengthy appeals process. My legislation is supported by many of the VSOs that are here today, and I'm thankful for their support, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. And I want to thank the committee for holding this hearing again, and I yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. And I would also like to remind all members when they are not speaking to please mute their microphones if they are participating remotely. I would now like to recognize Mr. Watkins for 3 minutes. Mr. Watkins, can you please verify that you are unmuted?
All right, Mr. Chairman, am I up?
Yes, you are recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Loria. And I'm honored to testify on one of the bills being considered today, my legislation, H.R. 6060, Veterans Burial Benefits Correction Act. H.R. 6060 would authorize the VA to provide outer burial receptacles for each new casketed grave site in a state or tribal cemetery that receives a grant from the Veterans Cemetery Grants Program. Providing an OBR is a crucial step in the burial process. It encases and protects the casket from the weight of the earth and heavy equipment that passes over the grave, and it prevents the ground from settling. By extending this benefit to state and tribal VA grant-funded cemeteries, this bill would create parity for this important burial benefit and is currently provided to our nation's veterans and their eligible families, members buried in VA national cemeteries, and would alleviate the financial burden on the veterans' families for purchasing an ORB if they choose to bury their loved ones in a state or tribal veterans cemetery. Through the National Cemetery Administration, our nation's veterans and their eligible family members have access to burial in 135 national VA cemeteries that honor military service. For veterans who do not have reasonable access to a national VA cemetery that is within 75 miles of their residence, the NCA's Veteran Cemetery Grant Program provides grants to state and tribal cemeteries. With the system of national, state, and tribal cemeteries, 95% of the veterans eligible for burial have reasonable access to a cemetery. It's our duty to ensure not only reasonable access to a cemetery, but proper burial and memorialization of our nation's heroes and adding financial burden to, and without adding financial burden to their families. To do so, burial benefits must be consistent regardless of whether the veteran or their eligible or their family member is buried in a national, state, or tribal cemetery. The Veterans Burial Benefit Correction Act is a common sense bill that creates parity for the OBR benefit and is an important step in ensuring consistent burial benefits. I look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you, Chairwoman Loria. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins, for your testimony. Mr. Brindisi, you are now recognized for 3 minutes.
I'd like to thank the chairwoman and ranking member for holding this hearing today and allowing me to testify in support of HR 5639, the Chuck Osher Burial Benefits Act. This bipartisan bill would fix an oversight in VA memorial benefits, which is impacting many veterans and their families. VA memorial benefits were designed with one kind of burial in mind. When a deceased veteran is interned in a traditional cemetery and furnished with a headstone or medallion. However, a similar memorial marker is not available for those who are not buried this way, including many who are cremated, MIA, or have burial at sea services. This bill would address this oversight by requiring the VA to furnish an urn or plaque in lieu of a headstone or marker if a deceased eligible veteran was not interred in a traditional cemetery. It is named in honor of Chuck Osher, who was a resident of Sherrill, New York. Chuck enlisted in the United States Air Force during the Vietnam War and served his country for 4 years, achieving the rank of sergeant. He was a man with a very strong sense of right and wrong, beloved by his family and his community. Chuck passed away on March 26, 2015, at age 64. Despite Chuck's service to his country, his family could not honor him with a VA-furnished marker because he was not laid to rest in a traditional cemetery. His widow, Donna, then contacted the congressman for our area at the time, Richard Hanna, to see how this problem could be fixed. Donna has stuck with this fight for 5 years, and I'm proud to fight alongside her in Chuck's memory to get this issue resolved. All veterans deserve to be honored for their service and their sacrifice, regardless of how their families choose to lay them to rest. Thank you again for the opportunity today, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Brindisi. Mr. Delgado, you are now recognized for 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be with you all today. I want to thank the chairwoman for the invitation, as well as the ranking member Boss. It is a real pleasure to speak with you all today about my bipartisan bill, the Fairness for Local Veteran Cemeteries Act. I introduced this bill alongside Reps Don Young, Elise Stefanik, and Brian Mast. Our bill represents a critical element of honoring the life and service of our nation's veterans. It is an easy bipartisan fix that makes an overdue correction to allow our localities to honor our nation's veterans in their final resting place. First, the background. At the beginning of my time in office, I established 4 advisory committees on priorities important to New York 19 constituents: veterans, ag, small business, and healthcare. The idea behind this bill came to me during one of my very first Veteran Advisory Committee meetings. Captain Steve Massey, who at the time was serving as director of the Ulster County Veteran Service Agency, highlighted a technical error in our law that prevents Ulster County and other counties across New York from accessing much needed federal funding for its veteran cemetery. As the law is written, only state-run veteran cemeteries are eligible for the National Cemetery Administration's Veteran Cemetery Grants Program. This prohibition cripples counties in states like New York that do not have state-operated veteran cemeteries, but rather county-operated facilities. Other states affected include Florida, Alaska, and Oregon, where veteran cemeteries are operated by the counties rather than the states. The Fairness for Local Veteran Cemeteries Act is simple. This bill will ensure counties and localities can access these funds to help establish, improve, or expand veteran cemeteries. This way, the Ulster County Veteran Cemetery and countless other cemeteries like it can maintain these spaces and allow us to honor our nation's heroes. Local governments across the country are already facing enormous government shortfalls. This simple language change would help remove another budgeting burden from counties and local governments that are already under strain. Our upstate veterans and veterans across our country answered the call to serve, and it is our solemn duty to care for and support them for years to come. We must ensure veteran burial needs are met. I urge the committee to join me in supporting this critical legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Delgado. Ms. Norton, you are now recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Chair Luria, Ranking Member Boston, members of the subcommittee. I thank you for holding this important hearing. I am pleased to testify on my Veterans Legal Support Act of 2019. It's HR 5019. I'm also grateful to Chair Takano for his consideration of this bill. My bill would allow the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to provide financial and other support to law school clinical programs that provide legal assistance to veterans, such as with filing and appealing claims for VA benefits and foreclosures. I am particularly fond of this bill because I was a tenured professor of law at Georgetown Law Center, even during the time that I have been here in Congress. There are already at least 22 law schools that have clinics devoted to veterans' legal needs, including William and Mary Law School Veterans Benefits Clinic, which serves as a national model and was the first recipient of a best practice certification from the VA. There are many other law schools, such as the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law, that are interested in starting their own VA certified clinics. We believe that more law schools would be interested in assisting veterans once this bill passes. Madam Chair, it is important to note that more than 400,000, and I'll repeat that number, 400,000 veterans are waiting for their disability claims to be processed by the VA. With the assistance of lawyers and law professors, clinical programs provide free legal resources to assist veterans with their VA benefits and other legal needs. Given this huge need, this bill builds on existing experience with law schools to meet the demand at little cost to the federal government. Now, as a tenured professor of law and continue to teach one seminar after being elected to Congress, I saw that the expert assistance from clinical programs can provide much assistance that would otherwise be unavailable. Again, I appreciate your holding this important hearing on this bill in particular, and look forward to working with you to see that it is passed by the House of Representatives. Thank you again, Chair Luria, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Norton, and thank you as well for recognizing the significant work that has taken place at William and Mary Law School as one of the examples of how this program could benefit our veterans. I'd like to now welcome our second panel from the VA. Testifying virtually before us today, we have Matthew Sullivan, the Deputy Undersecretary for Finance and Planning of the National Cemetery Administration. He is accompanied by Dan Keenan, Executive Director, Insurance Service of the Veterans Benefits Administration, Sean Clark, National Director, Veterans Justice Programs of the Veterans Health Administration, and joining us in person, Ms. Laureen Carson, Deputy Executive Director, Compensation Service of the Veterans Benefits Administration. For those joining us online, I would like to remind you to please ensure that you are muted as we move into panel number 2. I would like to start with Mr. Sullivan. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Luria. Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to provide the views of the Department of Veterans Affairs on pending legislation. Accompanying me today are Sean Clark, National Director, Veterans Justice Program, VHA, Dan Keenan, Executive Director, VA Insurance Service, VBA, and Laureen Carson, Deputy Executive Director, Compensation Service, VBA. Speaking on behalf of the National Cemetery Administration, I am pleased to note 3 bills on the agenda that are consistent with proposals in the President's fiscal year 2021 budget. VA supports HR 697 to pay for transportation of deceased eligible veterans to the nearest grant-funded veterans cemetery. HR 5487 the Veterans Cemetery Grants Improvement Act, and H.R. 6060 to authorize provision of outer burial receptacles for grant-funded cemeteries. H.R. 5019, the Veterans Legal Support Act of 2019, would authorize VA to provide support to eligible university law school programs that provide legal assistance to veterans. VA supports the concept in part, but underscores our proposal included in the fiscal year 2021 budget to allow VA to award grants or use cooperative agreements in working with public or private entities. VA opposes the bill's use of the medical services account for these grants, which is beyond the provision of medical care and services for eligible veterans. VA shares the goal of increasing access to legal services, particularly for veterans who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. We also welcome the opportunity to provide technical assistance on this legislation. H.R. 5048, the Fairness for Local Veteran Cemeteries Act, would authorize VA to provide grants to counties in addition to states for the establishment, expansion, and improvement of veteran cemeteries. VA does not support this legislation. Under the current Veteran Cemetery Grants Program, states have proven to be reliable partners in providing burial access to veterans and their families. VA does not believe that a county-level approach to grants provides long-term stability to the program. H.R. 5639, the Chucko Burial Benefits Act, would authorize VA to furnish urns or commemorative plaques to certain veterans whose remains were cremated and not interred in a national cemetery, a state veteran cemetery, a tribal cemetery, or a private cemetery. VA does not support this legislation because it would establish an inequity in the provision of burial benefits by singling out veterans who are cremated and whose remains are not interred in a cemetery. We believe there are sufficient burial and memorial products to recognize the service and sacrifice of all eligible veterans, including those who are not interred in a cemetery. H.R. 6013, the Veterans Families Financial Support Act, would create a new VA life insurance program for veterans with service-connected disabilities and sunset the current program. VA cannot support this bill in its current state, as it is unclear whether the interest rates referenced in the bill support neutral costing. VA strongly opposes the unnumbered bill that would require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to provide the designated representative of a claimant for VA benefits an opportunity to review a proposed determination before it becomes final. VBA discontinued its informal 48-hour review practice in part because the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims indicated that the policy was premised on disparate treatment between represented and unrepresented claimants that could not withstand legal scrutiny. This bill would bypass VA's internal quality review system, as well as the decision review options established by the Veterans Appeals Improvement and Modernization Act of 2017. This bill would turn what was previously a quick informal review by a local VSO located in or near a VBA regional office into an enforceable legal right with formal written notice. The bill would also greatly expand the applicability of the prior practice so that it would apply to all benefits determinations. These changes would likely add additional wait times to all represented veterans' claims and cause significant claims processing delays. VA has a responsibility to decide claims efficiently and without delay. To this end, VA is concerned about the delays in providing payments and services across the VA spectrum that will occur as a result of this bill. In addition, there are significant costs resulting from this bill that are detailed in VA's official testimony. This concludes my statement, Madam Chair. We would be happy now to entertain any questions you or the other members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. We will now begin with questions. I will first recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to start with a question for Ms. Carson, specifically about the last item that Mr. Sullivan was just discussing. You mentioned in your written testimony that this legislation would take what was previously a period, the 48-hour period, for correcting errors, not intended for expressing disagreement with the claim determination, and open it up for comments of all varieties. what I'm having trouble understanding is why, if we were to reinstate something that the VSOs already had as a quality control measure 48 hours before the determination was final, why do you think that period would be used any differently than it had previously been used?
So thank you for your question. A pivotal reason why we are discontinuing it is because the process was not formal, and the lack of formality in the process.
But now you're criticizing the formality. We're trying to give you formality, but the remarks by Mr. Sullivan just criticized that formality.
But the formality that you're giving us, it results in unintended consequences of notification, and it still creates a disparity between those represented and not represented within the VA system. In the courts, in the Rosinski case, it was for us to create a process that created parity for all claimants, not just for all representatives, but for all claimants.
So you're creating a worse situation for all claimants, is what I'm understanding.
We are.
I mean, the VSOs provide a valuable resource, and they have stated over and over again the importance of having this ability to review the record and correct clerical errors in that 48-hour time frame. Do you think that even if this particular language is not suitable, that we can, work together on something that will get the veterans what they need and allow the VSOs to provide this valuable service?
So what I struggle with in what you just stated was that there was no feedback loop, or the process was never intended just to be an error correction process. It was during a time when we had a very paper-intensive process, and they would get that review. The review also was to add missing information. It was at a time when we were in a paper-intensive environment where we had missing mail, where we had late-flowing documents. Now VSOs have the ability to, through electronic access, they can see the claim from the time it is established to the end. They can add and directly upload information throughout the process. But I would, again, state that I don't think that the process was ever intended to be an error correction or quality process. It's not rolled up into national quality, and it was during a time when they could walk down the hall and talk to a person directly about a local error on a physical, tangible claims folder where they were attaching mail.
So out of your explanation there, the VSOs can provide additional information up to any point. But at this point in time, do they know when they're within 2 days of the claim being closed?
So,
do they know that, this is the drop-off? I have a deadline here? So that's kind of what we're missing at this point.
Yeah, but
is if they think they have 5 more months, they have time to provide that information. But this is getting rid of that last window to provide additional information for the veteran, or just check that it's not there.
So one of the things that that VA does very well is track its cycle times. And in this 2-day cycle time, which is part of the cycle time tracking, we found that for those who do have access and who have the ability to utilize this 48-hour review, they're only utilizing it 32% of the time. So
that's 1/3 of the veterans who are getting a final look.
That they are representing, but that doesn't mean that 1/3 of those veterans are that there's errors associated with their 1/3 review.
So maybe the percentage is lower, but that's still a percentage of veterans who are getting a last look by a VSO who is there to help them and make sure their claim is correct. And I'm still lacking in understanding your argument as to why the VA opposes the opportunity for VSOs to help veterans as much as possible and keep them out of the process of appealing a claim later.
And I appreciate that. I would say, though, that in that means everybody has to wait for them to look at only 1/3, and we don't have any data that shows that they.
I mean, with all honesty, if it's taking months, years to get these done, is 48 hours so that some people get a final check a bad thing?
So our average time in processing claims is now at 90 days. We're not at years like we were several years ago. The other piece, if I may, there are other mechanisms for them to communicate, and there are proper mechanisms for us to track quality. We're in a national work queue environment instead of the local environment, and so we do utilize those processes with them. And just because they have a review doesn't mean that they won't utilize one of those processes in the future. We need to be able to track it.
Well, thank you, Ms. Carson. My time has expired. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Bost for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, Mr. Keenahan, I've been working with the VA for the past 2 years on the concept for HR 6013, which would improve and replace the existing SDVI program. As you know, at each step of the process, I've solicited the insurance services input, feedback, and I have incorporated all of the comments that they gave me in the bill. That's why I was really surprised whenever I learned the department's testimony that it now opposes my proposal. The testimony lacks detail, and I would like to know and be explained to why the VA reversed course on this bill in such a short period of time.
Good afternoon, Ranking Member Boss. Can you hear me, sir?
I can now.
Excellent. So on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs, thank you very much for your question. The VA recognizes there are multiple parts of the bill that can assist a large number of veterans and their financial planning. However, getting the costing right is critical to guaranteeing the proposed new program is self-supporting. And it is currently unclear whether the interest rates referenced in the bill support that neutral costing.
Okay, then let me follow up with that by asking, given how we collaborated and put this all approach together, we worked with you, why in the world did VA not reach out to me or one of the staffers to give us an answer before this hearing and then actually tell us why the reasons you were opposed, because we would have actually did some correcting prior to this hearing?
Sir, I thank you very much. If I understand you correctly, you're asking why we didn't reach out earlier.
Correct.
And the VA, again, sees many important parts of the bill that can help veterans open up things to improve on the existing SDVI program. However, we can't support the bill at this current time due to some of the costing concerns that exist.
Yeah, and once again, you didn't reach out after you found those concerns, but let me go on and ask something else here. So the testimony stated that it cannot support this bill and in its current state as it partially duplicates the existing SDVI program. How can the department say that you can't explain how this bill is duplicative of the SDVI program when the language in HR 613 actually sunsets the old SDVI program?
Ranking Member Boss, thank you for this question. There are some areas where the transition from the old program to the new program do create some uncertainty, and we would recommend for the program as proposed that there be some additional steps taken in the current bill before it would move forward.
Okay, so can you give me the steps?
Sorry, I don't fully understand the question.
You said that there were certain steps that need to be taken, and I want to know what those steps are so we can step in the right direction.
Yes, sir. So currently there's a disconnect between the language in the current bill and how the program would earn investment income. The interest earned in the revolving fund could potentially have a material effect on whether the program operates at a loss or is able to be self-sustained. The bill does not make a mention of the underlying interest rate that the revolving fund would earn, and it may add to the administrative costs. So we would need to resolve those steps in order to be able to ensure the bill could, or the program introduced in the bill, would be able to be self-funded.
Does the VA have suggested language that we can use?
So I believe we've been communicating and have received a request for technical assistance.
We had a request in March for that. Not in the last few days.
So I believe we have, as you addressed earlier, provided technical assistance earlier in order to be able to help ensure that several of the bill's proposals would be supported.
Okay.
However, at this time, the costing is not totally clear.
You do see the problem we have, though. You are the agency that we work with, and you are to bring us information. We sat down with you. We're trying to get this straightened out, and now here we are on a day of a hearing for this, and we thought everything's fine, and then you know, I worked a long time in the Illinois State Legislature, and to have an agency come and broadside me just before I'm getting ready to put a bill, whenever I've been working day in and day out with you, or the staff has, it's pretty unprofessional. And I'll move on to maybe some other questions. Mr. Sullivan, if a family chooses to bury their loved one in a grant-funded state or tribal veteran cemetery, is the family expected to cover the cost of the outer burial receptacle at this time?
Ranking Member Voss, thank you for the question. Currently, yes, the family member for the state and tribal veteran cemetery would be required to cover that cost, as the Department of Veterans Affairs does not provide for the cost of the outer burial receptacle in a state or tribal veteran cemetery.
Do we know what the average cost of an OBR is?
Sir, we have done some costing on OBRs. We have some general average costs. It's typically somewhere between $550 to $600. Those are the costs that we typically incur in terms of OBRs in our national cemeteries.
Well, thank you for answering the questions, and thank you for answering all the questions we had at that time, but my time's expired, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boss. I would now like to recognize Mr. Allred for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I have to say that the VA's testimony in opposition to my bill, HR 7443, is, in my opinion, wholly inadequate and very hard to make much sense of. And I just want to begin by asking you, Ms. Carson, it's been nearly 3 months since the VA eliminated the 48-hour review period, and we have been continuing to hear from VSOs urging that the period be reinstated. So I just want to know to what extent the VA has been having conversations with the VSOs. Are you including them in your considerations of this? Did you include them in your decision-making process before you made this decision?
Thank you for that question. I will say that this is not a new discussion with VSOs. We began having discussions at the inception of the Appeals Modernization Act. We worked with VSOs very diligently from 2016 until that act was implemented in 2019. Prior to that, we had a discussion with them that we were thinking about discontinuing that process in 2018. We then later on waited until the 1-year anniversary of implementation of AMA, which they were integrally a part of that process, to then revisit the 48-hour review discontinuation. We notified VSOs in March, and we let them know that we were going to discontinue at the end of April, which is what we did. We also had a briefing with the parties, the congressional parties as well, to let them know, and we let them all know on the same date.
Have you spoken to the VSOs since the decision was reached?
We have. We meet with the VSOs every month. Our USB meets with them every month, and they have direct access to a VSO liaison at our office.
And so I'm assuming that they've told you that they disagree with this decision.
Yes, they have told us.
Okay. Well, let's just, I just want to establish that you've been fully aware that these organizations that exist solely for the purpose of benefiting our veterans have come to you, have told you that this is a decision that's going to make it harder for them to get the veterans the benefits they are owed. You're aware of that. You've done this anyway. You now have a bipartisan bill, bicameral legislation to try and restore this review period. And your argument against it is that it is legally suspect, that the review period is legally suspect, something that a process that has been ongoing for some time that is now trying to be codified, as Chairwoman Luria said. And now you're saying that it's legally suspect. What's the basis for that argument?
So I would like to first and foremost state that it's a legacy process, as you've already indicated. The process of a pre-review has been going on since
But
1957.
what would be legally suspect about us as members of Congress creating now and codifying this process? What would be legally suspect about it?
It is because with your codification, you also have some unintended consequences that because you don't implicate whether or not the representative has to have access to VBA systems, you say all representatives. There are some representatives that don't electronically access our systems because they don't have the equipment. You also you say nothing about the pro se veteran, the veteran who chooses to represent him or herself, which is their own right. So there are some challenges with the bill.
Madam Chair, I'm reclaiming my time. Madam Chair. You're speaking to an attorney now and a member of Congress, and you're testifying that the inclusion of the language you just said makes the bill legally suspect. I mean, that you're on some pretty rocky ground there. And so I want to give you a chance to take that back or to clarify it.
So I will clarify that I never used the words legally suspect. You did, sir. And I would say that I'm not.
The testimony says, I'm reclaiming my time because I'm the one questioning here. The testimony says that the VBA, this is no longer appropriate and is legally suspect. That this practice is no longer appropriate and legally suspect. That's what the testimony that you submitted to our committee says. So I just want to be clear about that. I'm going to move on to my next question. And because I think we've established that the rationale is nonsense. Okay, the rationale to oppose it is nonsense. But I want to ask, why would we not want to, number one, allow our veterans to have some expert help in getting review of their claims and increase more appeals, adding more appeals on the back end, instead of getting these claims right on the front end? This makes no sense to me. I mean, I don't understand what the rationale would be to try and not have as good as possible and as reviewed as possible of claims on the front end so that you don't have as much work to do on the back end appealing claims that maybe had mistakes when they were submitted.
We don't disagree that we want claims to be done well and accurately, but we do believe that with our national quality system and with our Appeals Modernization Act, we do have the mechanisms upon which VSOs can work with us. And again, we've taken nothing away with regards to their representational aspects of being able to submit information and to clarify records at any time during the claims process.
Okay, well, I disagree with the testimony that's been submitted. I'm not sure what, lawyer wrote this, but I disagree with their legal interpretation of our ability as a committee to create this process. And I disagree with the reasoning we've been given today. And I just want to say that we should all be, from the committee to the VSOs to VBA, we should all be working on the same side to try and make sure that as many eligible veterans as possible get their benefits as quickly as possible, and that we provide as much help as we can to make sure that happens. And I for the life of me, I can't understand why we would want to make it harder for that to happen. And I know my time is close to being expired. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Allred, and we are going to move into a second round of questions because I think that these are some topics that bear a need for continued discussion. I will recognize myself for the second round for 5 minutes. And I would like to start by talking about HR 5019, the Veterans Legal Support Act of 2019, introduced by Ms. Norton, of which I'm a co-sponsor. And I'd like to direct this question to Mr. Sean Clark. Your testimony suggests that VA's legislative proposal involving pro bono legal services for veterans targeted homelessness. These legal clinics handle an entire scope of claims and assisting veterans with those claims. And we know that veterans can face a number of civil or criminal issues. We just had a hearing last week in this very same subcommittee where we heard some very heart-wrenching and personal testimonies about how difficult this claims process was, and heard from several organizations who help veterans through this claims process, a claims process to get them their health care benefits. So I'm just baffled as to why you interpreted this to be only to deal with homelessness, and then you basically say that the way in which Ms. Norton recommends that we fund this is inappropriate, when all the while we are truly just trying to get veterans the benefits they deserve. So, Mr. Clark, can you expound on that logic that you used?
Thank you, Chair Luria, for the question. And I'll begin with the latter part first, if that's all right. I'd start by noting that VA shares the goal of increasing access to legal services for veterans, and as you say, particularly for veterans who are homeless and at risk of homelessness. And that is the population.
I didn't say at homeless or risk of homelessness. Of course, we are concerned about veterans who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, but this is much broader. So what I'm asking is, why do you keep focusing in on that one issue and then using that as justification as to why the source of funding that Ms. Norton proposes is inappropriate? Because there are so many more issues, such as the hearing we had last week about character of discharge determinations and all of these things for which these legal services actually help veterans get the benefits that they deserve.
I certainly appreciate that, Chair Luria, and don't mean to suggest that homeless or at-risk veterans are the only veterans who have unmet legal needs. But through the department's annual challenge survey process, we have identified over the last 5 years and more that in that population, those who are homeless and at risk, the unmet needs, the list of unmet needs identified for that population is dominated by needs that call for legal services. And so as a part of the department's...
Okay, stop. I'm going to reclaim my time now. Okay, so within homeless veterans, they need legal services a lot. But that doesn't work in the inverse, that there's a much broader population of veterans who also need legal services. We just had a hearing in this subcommittee last week specifically talking about the character of discharge determinations and how desperately those veterans need legal services. And having spoken to one of these clinics at William & Mary Law School in my district who does great work with our veterans, and knowing that they and many other law schools around the country could help so many of our veterans, why are you opposing this legislation?
And ma'am, the objection regarding the use of the funding source does not have to do with VA providing funding for legal service providers by any means, because that is the essence of the department's proposal. But that proposal was informed and motivated by what VA has learned from that challenge survey that I mentioned about the needs in this particular population. So that's where that proposal is grounded. I absolutely don't mean to suggest that proves an absence of legal need in the broader veteran population, merely that was the impetus behind the department's proposal that is targeted at that homeless and at-risk population.
Well, thank you for your clarification. I still find it insufficient, and I still think it should be a top priority of this committee to try to get us help through as many partners and allies as we can to the veterans who need these legal services. I am going to yield back the remainder of my time and move on to Mr. Bost for a second round of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Keenahan, again, I want to ask this question to you. Can you please provide the main concern veterans have raised to the VA about the current SDVI program?
Chairman Boss, thank you very much for the question. In 2017, the VA conducted Veterans Life Insurance Needs Assessment, and we interviewed over 200 veterans and veteran service officers. And we gained some insights that veterans trust the VA in order to handle their life insurance. And the current rates offered in the Service Disabled Veterans Life Insurance Program are limited to $10,000. And as you had mentioned earlier, $10,000 2020 does not get you as far as you would as veterans or their families or beneficiaries would want to be able to do. And so this program, as proposed in the bill, would increase the face value. And importantly, it also would provide the Secretary of the VA the opportunity to increase the value as we gain more experience with the risk. Other concerns with the current program include the 2-year limit from when someone achieves or is provided a rating by the VA. The new program proposed in the bill would eliminate that 2-year period, and it would enable a veteran with service-connected disability rating to be able to apply for life insurance in a whole life insurance program up until they were 80. They would need to apply for a rating before they would turn 81. And this provides a consistent premium throughout the period of time that they would hold the life insurance policy. And that also provides an opportunity for people who are sensitive to income levels to being able to ensure that they would have a program in place. And so those are improvements that are in the bill that the current SDVI program does not have.
Right, is what we were looking for. Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, do you believe that more families would choose to bury their loved ones in a state, tribal, veteran cemetery that is closer to home if the VA paid for those burial transportation costs?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Bost. I wanted to clarify that the Mr. Banks' bill to pay for the transportation allowance is for unclaimed veterans in state and tribal veteran cemeteries. So currently, we do have the authority to pay for the transportation for unclaimed veterans that are interred in national cemeteries. This bill would bring parity to provide that same allowance for unclaimed veterans that are buried in state and tribal veteran cemeteries. So to directly answer your question, I don't think that it would really have an impact on the preference of a veteran or a family member to be buried in a state or tribal veteran cemetery over a national cemetery, but it would definitely bring parity for providing unclaimed veterans with a dignified burial at a state and tribal veteran cemetery as receive the same transportation allowance available to unclaimed remains that are buried in a national cemetery.
Okay, thank you. We got most of that. I think we're getting some feedback, maybe from one of the others not having muted their mic. Mr. Kean, I'm going to go back to you one more time, if I can, with the time I have left. Under H.R. 6013, veterans cannot be denied SDVI life insurance coverage, or cannot be denied SDI coverage for pre-existing health conditions. Can you please provide the percentage of claims that SDVI coverage that VA denied in FY19 due to non-service connected disabilities?
So that's a really important component that the program as proposed would not require medical underwriting. And I do not have the specific details to answer your question on as to the percentage of denials due to medical underwriting. And I could get that information.
Yeah, if you could get that to us, because we think the number is fairly large. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boss. I would like to recognize Mr. Sablon for up to 7 minutes. I didn't recognize you the first round, but we've been allowing up to 7 minutes. So, Mr. Sablon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Loria. Can I pass and come up on the next one? I am actually juggling between 3 different meetings, but I apologize actually, but can I pass for now on? And you to the next member, and then I'll come up after that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sablon. I will recognize myself again for 5 minutes. This time I'd like to talk about HR 5048, the Fairness for Local Veterans Cemeteries Act. I'd like to pose this question to Mr. Matthew Sullivan. In your written testimony, you explained that expanding the NCA grants to county cemeteries could undercut the VA's effort to encourage the 4 remaining states to apply for veteran cemeteries through its grant program. So basically, something that we're trying to do to help veterans could
always still be a higher priority in this grant. However, what this bill does is it provides us the flexibility that if we have sufficient funding available after we fund all of the higher priority grants on the priority list, we would not be constrained by a $5 million cap in funding these projects. This can especially come into use later in the process when certain projects that may have been selected for award that year, for whatever reason, just are not ready to move forward because they'd run into some unexpected issues. And late in the year, we can use those funds to fund a relatively quickly executable O&M grant and project. And sometimes we are not able to do that because of the $5 million cap.
No cemeteries or no national cemeteries and what it takes for, and did you say 4 jurisdictions have no national cemetery? Am I correct?
No, sir. There are 5 states that do not have grant-funded state cemeteries.
So, but all the territories in the Pacific, at least, none of them has a national cemetery, right? American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas. And so the distance between the Northern Marianas and Honolulu would be the closest for a national cemetery. That's the distance is about 3,700 miles, if I'm correct.
Well, sir, we believe that that area is sufficiently served through the grant-funded the territorial cemeteries there.
Right.
And since that's sufficiently served and there are populations of unserved veterans large enough to warrant establishment of a national cemetery, we will continue to support that area through the grants program.
Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate that, and I agree that there are national. I don't think a national cemetery is merited in the Northern Marianas at this time. But I think also that the 5 million is at this time insufficient as the number of veterans pass on and choose to be buried in their state, their jurisdiction, their localities. So family members are closer to make visits to the research. Madam Chair, I have remaining time, and I would yield to you if you need time. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sablan. I believe that concludes our questioning for this panel. I want to thank the representatives from the VA and National Cemetery Administration who joined us for this panel. And we would like to take a few minutes to reset for our next group of witnesses. So we will take a brief recess while we prepare the table for our next group of witnesses. I'd like to call this hearing back to order and introduce our witnesses for the third panel. Appearing before us virtually is Matthew Doyle, Deputy Director of the National Legislative Service of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Frank Logalbo, Benefits Training Manager of the Wounded Warrior Project. Joining us in person, we have Mr. Shane Learman, Deputy National Legislative Director for Benefits with the Disabled American Veterans, and Diane Rober, Executive Director of the National Organization of Veterans Advocates. I'd like to start by recognizing Mr. Doyle for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Loria, Ranking Member Bost, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the men and women of the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the United States and its auxiliary, thank you for the opportunity to testify on legislation pending before this subcommittee. The VFW agrees with the intent of H.R. 5019, the Veterans Legal Support Act of 2019, but cannot offer its support at this time. This legislation would permit VA to provide financial support to university law school programs that provide legal assistance to veterans. We agree that some university legal clinics offer an invaluable service to veterans. The AmeriCorps Veterans Legal Corps has partnerships with law schools at Touro College, William & Mary, and others to provide services at faculty-supervised clinics. These clinics assist veterans with countless legal issues, including VA disability compensation claims and appeals, landlord-tenant matters, bankruptcy, and child support modifications. Within the AmeriCorps Public Service Framework, an infrastructure of vetting and collaborating with veteran-centric legal clinics already exists. Accordingly, instead of creating a new federally funded initiative, we recommend appropriating additional resources to expand the AmeriCorps program to include law schools where veteran-specific clinics don't currently exist. The VFW is proud to support H.R. 6013, the Veteran Families Financial Support Act. This legislation would increase the maximum payment under the Service Disabled Veterans Insurance Program from $10,000 to $40,000 and extend eligibility beyond the current 2-year period after a veteran receives notification of a new service-connected disability. SDVI insures eligible veterans for up to $10,000. This amount has remained unchanged since the Eisenhower administration and is insufficient to cover the rising cost of end-of-life expenses. This bill would rightfully increase the maximum coverage amount of SDVI to $40,000. Furthermore, service-disabled veterans are frequently unable to obtain private life insurance due to their disabilities. All too often, we hear from our members who lament not having chosen SDVI coverage when they were eligible. Since a veteran may only apply for SDVI within 2 years of receiving notification of a new service-connected disability, many service-disabled veterans who elect not to obtain SDVI find themselves uninsurable once their eligibility period has expired. This would also expand eligibility beyond the current 2-year window and would undoubtedly increase the number of service-disabled veterans enrolled in SDVI. The VFW supports H.R. 7443. This legislation would codify and reinstate VA's 48-hour review policy. The 48-hour review policy was an essential feature of the VA claims process. It provided accredited service officers with an opportunity to review initial ratings decisions for accuracy prior to formal promulgation. After reviewing a rating decision, service officers were permitted to notify VA of any irregularities, misconditions, typographical errors, or other mistakes. 48-hour review provided a process for errors with disability claims to be speedily resolved at the lowest level. VA has claimed that the decision to rescind the 48-hour review policy was an effort to expedite the delivery of benefits to veterans. However, without 48-hour review, more veterans will be forced to correct claims errors in one of the 3 lanes permitted under the AMA. VA's current goal for completing higher-level review or rendering a decision on a supplemental claim is 125 days. It is therefore incomprehensible to believe that any veteran would prefer an erroneous decision right now and wait 125 days for a mistake to be resolved, rather than have a trusted service officer take an additional 48 hours to review their claim. VA's argument is illogical and borders on the absurd. We used to see daily examples of why 48-hour review was necessary. In April, a VFW service officer in Michigan reviewed an initial claim decision for a veteran with multiple suicide attempts, whose claim for PTSD was about to be denied. The service officer quickly recognized that the veteran's C&P exam was not conducted properly and was able to stop the claim denial before it ever reached the veteran. Had VA moved forward with this rating decision for a veteran who was at a high risk for harming himself, the results could have been catastrophic. I shudder to think about the kind of harm that veteran might have inflicted upon himself during the 125 days before higher level review or a supplemental claim was adjudicated. I'd also like to note that this example directly contradicts Ms. Carson's testimony, as this was entirely VA's error, not missed mail or late flowing documents. Our service officers have also used 48-hour review to correct erroneous effective dates proposed by VA, as well as VA's incorrect calculation of ratings percentages. Again, all VA's errors, not missed mail or late flowing documents. We cannot stress enough how important 48-hour review is for the timely and accurate delivery of veterans benefits. It became so ingrained in the disability claims process, both paper-based and digital, that it is difficult to imagine what the future of veterans claims will look like without it. Accordingly, we strongly urge the passage of HR 7443 to reinstate 48-hour review. Madam Chair, this concludes my testimony. Again, the VFW thanks you and the ranking member for the opportunity to testify on these important issues before this subcommittee. I'm prepared to take any questions you or the subcommittee members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Logalbo for 5 minutes.
Chairman Murray Loria, this ranking member Boss, and distinguished members on Subcommittee of Disability and Moral Affairs, thank you for inviting Wounded Warrior Project today to testify on these important bills being considered. As an organization dedicated to providing support to our nation's ill and injured veterans, we have humble privilege of serving with severe illness and injuries. Throughout this frontline assistance, WWP unfortunately witnessed firsthand not all veterans recover from their wounds. When this happens, they leave behind grieving families. Because of this, we would like to use our time today to discuss HR 6013, the Veterans Family Financial Support Act. As this bill has the ability to drastically help the veterans and families we support by increasing the VA's life insurance program. We believe the VA's Service Disabled Veterans Life Insurance Program does not adequately address today's needs when a veteran dies from their illness or injuries. The primary concern we often hear is that current SDVI program cap level of $10,000 is not sufficient to cover all costs associated with losing a loved one. The loss of a loved one causes severe emotional pain for the bereaved family, and the fear of financial hardships can have a significant negative impact. For this reason, it is absolutely critical for every veteran's emotional and financial wellness that they, like all people, have access to appropriate life insurance coverage to ensure their families do not suffer added financial distress when they die. Unfortunately, veterans with service-connected injuries often find it impossible to purchase affordable life insurance plans on the open market. Lifelong disabilities incurred while serving our nation provide reason for many insurance companies to either decline coverage or offer unaffordable policies. In 1951, Congress addressed this problem by creating the SDVI insurance program, and today the SDVI program remains the only viable and affordable option for many veterans to obtain life insurance. Under the current SDVI program, disabled veterans may purchase life insurance coverage up to $10,000, which, while this amount is better than nothing, it does not nearly cover the amount needed when a veteran passes away. Many SDVI program provisions are severely outdated. Perhaps the most shockingly is the statutory cap of $10,000, which remained unchanged since the program's inception in 1951. Today, that amount is barely sufficient to cover funeral and burial costs without accounting for the immediate loss of family income or unforeseen expenses. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, $10,000 in 1951 would be worth the equivalent of $99,000 today. Over my 25-year career, I have assisted many veterans with severe injuries or disabilities in applying for SDVI insurance. I would like to share with you a recent example of a veteran and a family that visited our WWP office to inquire about assistance in filing for a claim for a new service-connected disability with the goal to obtain SDVI insurance because of the warrior's recent diagnosis of cancer. The veteran and spouse were very concerned with the recent diagnosis and their ability to secure life insurance. They were concerned with what options were available to them to mitigate the risk of financial hardship if the warrior were to die. Not only does the veteran and family have to struggle with the treatments and the uncertainty of the future, they now have to file a claim with the VA and hope service connection for the disability is granted. Even if the claim is granted, the total amount of $10,000 will not help beyond the minimal burial cost. The Veterans Family Financial Support Act would eliminate the 2-year enrollment period in lieu of the 2-year waiting period. It will eliminate the need to file a claim for a new service-connected disability to qualify the program, and it would remove the need for medical underwriting, thus removing the potential for denial. Most importantly, this bill will increase the maximum coverage to $40,000 to provide families with the adequate payment to cover end-of-life costs. Because of this, Wounded Warrior Project fully supports H.R. 6013, the Veterans Family Financial Support Act, and encourages Congress to move forward with the important piece of legislation. We thank you for your time today and for inviting Wounded Warrior Project to testify on these issues, and we look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Logalbo. I would now like to recognize Mr. Learman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Luria, Ranking Member Bost, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of DAV's more than 1 million members, we thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My oral remarks will focus on 2 of the bills on today's agenda. First, H.R. 6013, the Veterans Family Financial Support Act, would create a new veterans life insurance program which would be self-funded with premiums based on the administrative and claims costs of the program. It would be available to service-connected veterans prior to the age of 81 without any time restrictions for applications and would offer coverage amounts up to $40,000. We acknowledge the current Service-Disabled Veterans Insurance Program, known as SDVI, does have significant limitations. However, SDVI does provide a waiver of premiums on the basic coverage of $10,000 for eligible totally disabled veterans. The proposed program would replace the existing SDVI program, as it would not allow any new applications or new policies effective December 31st, 2022. While this will not have any impact on existing policyholders, this means the elimination of premium waivers for current eligible and future eligible totally disabled veterans. We see the value of the proposed insurance program, its advantages to veterans, and its ability to overcome the limitations in the existing SDVI program. However, DAV opposes H.R. 6013. And just to clarify, we oppose the elimination of the ability for totally disabled veterans who by definition are unemployed with limited income to receive free life insurance. We offer 2 recommendations: allow both programs to exist or provide a waiver of premiums for $10,000 for totally disabled veterans under the new proposed program. DAV welcomes the opportunity to work with the subcommittee on this issue. In reference to H.R. 7443, Madam Chair, for over 7 decades, VA maintained a policy which allowed accredited VSOs a review period for all VA decisions prior to final promulgation for those veterans and claimants they represented. On April 24th, VBA officially eliminated the VSO review period. DAV is disappointed with the VA's decision to end this policy and fully supports H.R. 7443, the Veterans Claim Transparency Act. It would reestablish the review period, and this would include all accredited claims agents and attorneys. Madam Chair, as a DAV service officer and advocate for over 22 years, I have personally reviewed thousands of VA decisions during the VSO review period. After reviewing these decisions, we were able to notify VA of mistakes before decisions were formally decided. When VA took actions on our recommendations, they would issue a new decision. This process impacted thousands of veterans and claimants, and in many instances, avoided the time-consuming and often costly appeals process. In my experience, as well as that of our hundreds of DAV service officers across the country, VA leaders and rating specialists often stated that review by VSOs helped identify issues that required corrective action before the claim being finalized. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, VA has ceased delivering paper copies of written notices to VSOs that are co-located at VA facilities. Since the elimination of the review period, VA is no longer advising VSOs electronically of decisions being rendered. Although VA has presented a way to manually find a claim status in VBMS, by definition, this does not provide actual electronic notification of the final decision. By not providing electronic notification and paper notices, we believe VA is not in compliance with 38 U.S.C. Section 5104, which requires VA to provide the claimant and their representative a notice of decisions. Although VA has claimed that the review period is no longer necessary, 8 VSOs representing millions of veterans and 42 state attorneys general have voiced their disagreement with VA's decision. Therefore, we need the subcommittee to take swift legislative action on H.R. 7443 to protect those men and women wounded, injured, or made ill during their military service. Madam Chair, this concludes my testimony. I would be pleased to answer any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Learman. Ms. Robber, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Luria, Ranking Member Bost, and members of the subcommittee, NOVA thanks you for the opportunity to testify today. I will focus our oral testimony on 2 bills, H.R. 7443 and H.R. 5019, and address how VA's policies perpetuate representational inequities. Our members, a number of whom are veterans themselves, advocate before VA, the Board of Veterans' Appeals, the CAVC, and the Federal Circuit on behalf of our nation's veterans and their families. First, NOVA supports H.R. 7443 and the reinstatement of the 48-hour review period. We thank Representative Allred for introducing this measure and urge Congress to pass it. VA's reasons for discontinuing this policy were flawed, as we detail in our written statement. The policy provided representatives with an ability to intervene before a decision was finalized and have obvious errors corrected quickly. Even with new review options under the Appeals Modernization Act, 48 extra hours to review a decision can save months, if not years, of appeal and get veterans their earned benefits faster. The decision to eliminate the review process is tied to a CAVC decision that required VA to provide an attorney with written notice of its decision to deny him 48-hour review access. Contrary to VA's testimony today, the CAVC decision focused on disparate treatment of advocates, not the status of claimants. In announcing discontinuation of this policy, VA suggested it would be burdensome for them to provide accredited attorneys and agents with this access due to IT infrastructure considerations. It's unclear what those IT considerations are, however, because numerous NOVA members report they indeed had the access and used it to benefit their clients. For example, one attorney used the process to ensure a veteran was properly service-connected for a psychiatric disability. Another advocate caught an error that fixed an effective date for a claimant, mind you, from 2019 to 1966. Still, a third reported having an error fixed on nearly a weekly basis by using this process. Another reason VA provided for eliminating the 48-hour review is a desire to reduce, quote, representational inequities. While we agree that representational inequities need to be eliminated, it would be far more veteran-friendly for VA to give all advocates the tool rather than denying it to everyone. If VA is truly interested in eliminating representational inequities, it will work with NOVA, law school veterans clinics, and law firms who commented on recent proposed regulations governing electronic access and seek to provide meaningful access equal to that of our VSO colleagues. Such action would give full voice to 38 CFR 3.103E, which states that, quote, claimants are entitled to representation of their choice at every stage in the prosecution of a claim. As noted by CAVC Chief Judge Davis in 2018, the increased involvement of attorneys in the adjudication process, both at the adversarial and non-adversarial stages, suggests that the disparate treatment of VSO representatives and attorneys has perhaps outlived its usefulness and may no longer be rationally justified. VSOs, attorneys, and agents all work for a common goal, ensuring veterans receive all the benefits they have earned. Disparate treatment of advocates needs to stop. NOVA also supports HR 5019, which would provide financial grants to law school veterans clinics. These clinical programs offer vital outreach and critical legal services to veterans. In addition, many of these clinics educate students in VA law and policy. Some go on to practice in the field after graduation. Advocates trained in veterans law and policy provide invaluable service in private practice, in legal aid organizations and clinics, for VA, and as law clerks at the CAVC. Law school clinics are often underfunded and have to rely on private donations to operate. Financial support is helpful at any time, but particularly crucial now. The pandemic has resulted in revenue loss to educational institutions and potentially affected private donors. This bill could provide an important infusion of funds to ensure legal services to veterans are not interrupted. We urge Congress to pass this bill and consider additional funding in the future. Again, we appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I would be happy to answer any questions the subcommittee might have.
Thank you, Ms. Robert, for your testimony. We will now shift into questioning period. I will reserve my questions until the end, and I will recognize Mr. Allred first for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to our panel for being with us. And I want to talk about my legislation, HR 7443, the Veterans Claims Transparency Act. And Mr. Doyle, I'd love to begin with you and Mr. Learman, Ms. Robert as well, if y'all could all weigh in on the benefits, as you've seen in your experience, of getting these claims right on the front end, as opposed to the lengthy appeals process, which, by the way, and every member of the subcommittee in our congressional offices, we then are also asked to help out as well with these lengthy appeals because folks are waiting and they're trying to find out what's going on. So if y'all could just weigh in on what you think the benefit is of getting this right in the front end, opposed to on the back end.
Well, sir, I think that not only does it eliminate the need to go through the reviews, either through the AMA or actually go to an appeal to the board or to the CAVC, but it actually benefits VA because it's an opportunity to get a decision right and avoid them also having to be engaged in further review down the road.
Mr. Doyle.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Allred. So timeliness is absolutely one of the biggest issues that 48-hour review helped us to resolve. So veterans aren't required to utilize the appeals infrastructure to resolve their claims for very simple errors that could be corrected on a very small level, on a very low level. And we saw tremendous gains with the passage of the Appeals Modernization Act a couple of years ago. And our concern is also that those gains will be eroded with the repeal of the 48-hour review process.
Yes, Congressman, the 40-hour review process, what it was capable and what it done for veterans that we've represented and seen is almost incalculable because it can correct something so much faster than having to wait an appeals process period. For example, I also worked at DAV's National Appeals Office at the Board of Veterans Appeals, and there were times when I would even see decisions that were being appealed at the Board of Veterans Appeals 4 or 5 years later that were issues that could have been caught and corrected at that 48-hour VSO review. So veterans should not have to wait months or years to get the correct benefits they're entitled to right now, and HR 7443 would go a long way for that.
And I'm assuming that, based on y'all's experience, that you would agree that the VA claim that the 48-hour review process is legally questionable is not one that has any grounding or backing. You know, the case that they're calling on, Mr. Doyle, that you mentioned in your testimony, the Rosinski case here, even in the case, Secretary Wilkie claimed that the 48-hour review policy was proper because of the historic special relationship that exists between the VA and the VSOs. And as they've commented on how it has improved the process, Is there any basis to this claim that it's a legally questionable policy to allow for a 48-hour review?
Absolutely not. I mean, 48-hour review was VA's own policy. And so are we expected to believe that they exceeded their authority in implementing that policy in the first place? Absolutely not. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Ms. Robert, Mr. Learman, do you have anything you want to add to that? Or?
Frankly, I think that decision really went to the issue that attorneys and agents wanted the same access that everyone else had, more than to the issue of whether or not the claimant was represented or unrepresented. And I think VA's concern was that that decision was leading them in the direction of being required to give it to all advocates.
And I would agree. I don't believe there's any real basis for their comment that it isn't legally sustainable or can't be done. I think the only, from the only point of view that it would be legally suspect for us from VAs, it will open them up potentially for other lawsuits. And I think that's actually what they're referring to.
Yeah, I can see that, Mr. Learman. And I'll just, Madam Chair, if you could allow Ms. Robert, I know my time is going here. If you could allow her to respond to one quick question from me, which is that, you know, this bill expands the 48-hour review to attorney advocates, and just ask you why it's important, Ms. Robert, for attorney advocates to be able to also represent veterans in this capacity.
Well, attorneys represent at all levels of the VA process, up through the courts, both in private practice and in pro bono practice, and you know, consider ourselves to be equal to all the other advocates that are out there, and certainly have the training and ability to assist our nation's veterans, and we need to have access to all the tools that all other advocates have.
Well, thank you all for your testimony, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you, Mr. Allred. I am now going to recognize Mr. Bost for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, first question, Mr. Legalbo, can you elaborate on the testimony you gave regarding why $10,000 is not enough life insurance coverage to meet veterans' needs today?
Yes, sir. Been an advocate over 25 years, and the $10,000, as you indicated as well, would be just enough to cover just for the burial, and it doesn't look at the end of the other end of life cost that would also be out there as well. And it expands the option for a veteran to purchase up to $40,000. And the whole life policy, which is written, the overall policy would be a lot cheaper now compared to the old policy, which is term insurance.
Do you believe that a lot more veterans would take advantage of the SDVI program if it raised to $40,000?
I do, and also it's important to note there's no medical underwriting required in the bill. So I think a lot of veterans would definitely take advantage of the program.
I think so too. Mr. Doyle, under the current SDVI program, veterans have 2 years from receiving the award of service connection for a new condition to apply for coverage. Is 2 years enough time for veterans to determine if the FDVI life insurance is right for them?
I don't think 2 years is long enough at all. I think many veterans, after they receive their rating decision, they're more focused on the percentage that they were going to be service connected, their monthly benefits payments, and other issues that they're dealing with at the time. They aren't necessarily tracking, you know, the 2-year window for signing up for this important program.
Does VFW support the model at HR 6013, which would allow veterans to apply for SDVI coverage at any time, but subject to a 2-year waiting period?
So we unambiguously and unconditionally support HR 6013.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Legalbo, again, 6013 would ensure that veterans cannot be denied life insurance coverage for any pre-existing health condition, including service-connected disabilities. Can you give detail why veterans should not be penalized for service-connected conditions when applying to VA life insurance coverages?
Yeah, so my experience, the current STVI program, example is the individual I used that, suffered for cancer. If they applied for the current STVI program, they would be denied under underwriting. With the no medical underwriting required, it's going to give an opportunity for more veterans to apply and allow for greater coverage to support the veterans and their families in a time of need.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we get those things on the record. But so, Mr. Learman, in your testimony, you explained that DAV's service officers recently stopped receiving paper and electronic notifications of complete decisions. However, it appears that the VA is working to correct those challenges with paper notices, according to your statement. Can you tell me more about why that problem? If you can just expand there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the mail issues with inside VA facilities, they stopped delivering mail to a lot of VA or VSO offices co-located with the VA, like DAV service officers around the country, as well as VFW and American Legion. So they stopped delivering the mail, so we were no longer receiving that paper notification of the final decision. Then when they stopped the electronic notification on April 24th, we were no longer being notified electronically. So we are not being notified right now, either via email or a decision or via paper by VA on final decisions. Last week, they did indicate to us they are working on a program to start delivering all paper notices of decisions to all of the VSOs. They are working on that. But as far as the electronic notification, again, it's just you're required to track every case in VBMS individually to determine if a decision has or has not been rendered. But again, that doesn't meet the definition of being notified a decision was completed.
Did they give a reason, and I'm real short on time here, but did they give a reason why they stopped the electronic notification?
Because that was part of the end of the 48-hour VSO review period.
Yeah, that was part of that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boss. I now recognize Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'd like to yield my 5 minutes to you or who you designate. You can yield it to anyone who needs time.
Thank you, Mr. Sablon. So I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I'd like to start out by directing this question to Mr. Matthew Doyle relative to HR 7443, the Veterans Claim Transparency Act of 2020. I understand that the VFW was previously only able to review between one third and 1/4 of their members' claims within the 48-hour window. Given that a relatively small number of claims are reviewed, can you explain why it's so important that the VA should still preserve this pre-decisional review period?
Thank you for your question, Madam Chair. So I'd first like to note that this is not a statistic that we maintain on a national level. We didn't really track the number of claims that benefited from 48-hour review. However, I had a conversation yesterday with some of our BDD service officers in Winston-Salem, and they informed me that they used to exercise 48-hour review for absolutely every single one of the claims that they filed. And they also indicated to me that out of those claims, roughly 15% had some kind of an error that therefore benefited from the use of 48-hour review. And so I think there is a significant number of claims that benefited from this process, although the data may have been difficult for us to track on our level.
Well, thank you. And I did not hear any testimony from the VA specifically about numbers related to this. So I am also curious to understand, and we can follow up to ask that information, if they have collected data on those claims that were readdressed during this 48-hour period, unless any of the other VSOs participating today have received that data at any point. Mr. Learman, are you aware of any data?
Chairwoman, no, I'm not aware of any specific data, but I do know they have reported a low amount of VSOs actually used the system. And I think part of it is within that 48-hour VSO review window as it stood before, you had 48 hours to review the decision, find something wrong, contact somebody electronically at your local regional office, have them contact somebody at the regional office where the case was done, have them contact that rating specialist in order to try to get the case changed. So all I'm trying to say is, a lot of times those actions were done without the decision being formally checked off on or signed off or corrected, because the amount of things that have to happen in 48 hours to get it fixed always didn't happen before the 48-hour review would stop. Just because you would start to try to get it corrected doesn't mean the 48 hours would pause. So if you were in the middle of trying to get it fixed, 48 hours came up, it was pulled and promulgated.
So you're saying that a VSO could review a claim of a veteran, realize that there was an error. As an example given here, I think someone stated there was a claim that was adjudicated that the benefit should have started in 2019, when in reality it was 1974. A gross error, but in reality could have just been a clerical error on the part of the VA. So if you were to find that error during this 48-hour period, you're telling me that you would have to notify one person who would sequentially have to notify a whole host of 3 or 4 other people. And if that wasn't resolved by the time the 48 hours was over, then the decision was final and it went out and everything had to go back through the review process?
That's correct, Chairwoman. If that whole process wasn't done in that 48-hour window, they would just promulgate the decision.
And how is a VSO, when this was still being used, how are you notified that a decision's pending within 48 hours? You better act quickly.
They had a queue set up inside VBMS to where each VSO's rating decisions for review were there, and you had 48 hours to review them before they were removed from there and then moved on to be promulgated.
So as a VSO, did you have to go look for this or check this queue every day, or did you proactively get something saying, here you go, these things are in the last 48 hours before it is?
You had to check that queue every day to make sure you didn't miss any decisions that were being added in there. So it was your responsibility as a VSO to look every single day for those decisions.
And did the 48-hour period include weekends and holidays too?
Yes, that was a problem at one time, Chairwoman. They would put decisions in there on Thursday afternoon, and then if they were working forced overtime on Sunday afternoon, they'd pull that decision and promulgate it without anybody seeing it. That had been addressed several times and for the most part had been corrected, but still, that was part of it.
Okay, and in your testimony, and I know Mr. Boss sought to clarify this a little bit, but I still don't understand what you were saying, that there's no paper notification currently, and there's also no electronic notification. How is anybody getting notified right now? I don't understand your comments from earlier. Can you help me?
Yes, Chairwoman. Veterans are being notified via mail. So the veteran is being notified by their paper decision. Their representatives, VSOs, co-located in VA regional offices right now, are not being notified of that decision with a paper notice, nor are we getting an electronic notice.
But you can go in this queue that you referred to and check an individual file if you want to know the status?
We can't look in that queue anymore, Chairwoman, because that's been removed because they removed the 48-hour review period. So that queue's been removed, so those decisions are no longer put in there. If we want to find out what's going on with any of the 250,000 claimants we represent, we have to manually look and track every claimant. And again, that's not going to tell us a decision is imminent. That's only going to let us know one hasn't been done yet or one was done yet. But we aren't actually notified.
Well, thank you. That clarifies a lot for me, and I think it gets back somewhat to the questions I asked, during the last panel, because the VA said, well, the VSO can put stuff in there whenever they want to up until the end, but what you're telling me, this confirms what I thought. You don't know when the end is. You don't know when that last opportunity is to help that veteran. Is that correct?
Currently, that is correct, yes, Chairwoman.
I have gone over my time. Mr. Boss, do you have any more questions, or do you? Okay, yes, I recognize Mr. Boss for 5 minutes.
There we go, that's better. Mr. Doyle, can you please explain why it is important for the VA to cover the cost of outer burial reciprocals for veterans buried in grant-funded state and tribal veteran cemeteries?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Bost. So it's important for VA to cover the cost of outer burial receptacles because the cost of such receptacles are already covered for interments that take place through DoD, through VA in NCA cemeteries, and also for interments that occur with the National Park Service. And so this bill would really just provide parity for veterans who are buried at state and tribal cemeteries that receive grants from NCA.
Okay. Mr. Lerman, can you please explain your testimony regarding the reasons why DAV has concerns that H.R. 5019 would require VA to pay for the University Legal Clinics Assistance Program through funding from the Medical Services account?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yes, based on the language of the bill, that is one of the mechanisms that could pay for the bill was through the medical services. We just think that there should be another mechanism to pay for the program. We don't oppose it. We just want to make sure that if it is going to go through and be funded, that it be done in a way that doesn't take money out of medical care and needs from the VA.
Other programs, okay. Mr. Agalbo, can you please explain how increasing the cap for VCGP's maintenance and operation grant under H.R. 5487 would improve services to veterans and their families?
Yes, thank you for that question. As stated, the grant amount would go from $5 million to $10 million, and it would increase that amount and funding to be able to operate and maintain, veteran cemeteries. So it is a very important piece of legislation.
Okay, my last question is for Mr. Doyle. Please, can you tell us more about why the VFW believes that H.R. 519 is duplicative of other federal funded programs such as AmeriCorps?
Thank you for your question. So AmeriCorps already has an infrastructure for engaging university law school programs that provide services to veterans, and it also has a system of vetting those clinics to ensure that they can handle the work that they are taking on. And so providing VA with the authority to provide grants to these universities is duplicative of AmeriCorps' efforts, and it seems that AmeriCorps already has the expertise to do so, and so it might make sense to instead enhance the ability of AmeriCorps to continue these programs.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I know I haven't used all my time, but I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boss. And I just have one last line of questioning, this time for Ms. Robber, specifically about H.R. 5019, the Veterans Legal Support Act. There's been a lot of back and forth in the previous panel about, who this would benefit, how, what types of situations that veterans find themselves in that they benefit from when they interact with one of these veterans legal clinics, such as the one at William and Mary. Can you just expand on that again, and where you think that the most benefit would come from this program?
Well, I think that there are many clinics that obviously work in the disability benefits arena, but a lot of clinics do a whole wide range of provide a wide range of services, discharge upgrades, which are very important. Some clinics focus on other civil legal help. I know there was discussion about homelessness and at risk of homelessness. There are many unmet civil legal needs like housing, child support, estate planning, those types of things. There are some clinics that also work within the veteran treatment courts and help veterans who are taking advantage of those services. Some help with disability programs that are outside of VA. And I would also note there was some discussion about the medical aspect, and I know that some clinics team up with other legal aid organizations and actually go into VA as part of the medical legal partnership and participate in programs that offer veterans the opportunities to come in and get either services directly or referrals out to the community for services. So I think there's a wide range of issues and things that these clinics work on. And, while I note Mr. Doyle's point about AmeriCorps, I think there are many clinics that are fully vetted by the universities themselves and are very deserving of these funds outside of the AmeriCorps program.
Well, thank you. And, I think it's good to show that there is an example through the AmeriCorps program, but I certainly think that by establishing a grant program to provide assistance to these clinics, that there would be a process and there would be metrics for them to show their benefit to veterans. So I support this bill. I'm a co-sponsor with Ms. Norton, and I appreciate you talking about the merits of this legislation. So I do not have any further questions. Mr. Boss, would you like to take any time for a closing statement?
Just real quickly, if I can, Madam Chair. These bills we've discussed, I think some of the answers that the VA was actually giving us were, this wasn't their best performance on being able to respond to us. Worked very well with them. I am thinking that it's very important that if all of a sudden they change a position, I think that was clear, that if they're working with us and we're working with them, I think it's their job to come back before we get into a hearing and before broadsiding one of the members while they're trying to work in good faith in a manner that allows this process to work. Other than being disappointed with that, I think the legislation, most of the legislation is before us. It's good legislation, and I look forward to moving on and adjusting and fixing any problems that might be in it as we move forward. And thank you very much with that, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Boss. I echo your concern, specifically about last-minute changes to whether the VA supports or has any specific issues with legislation right before something like this hearing, where we have an opportunity to discuss it. So I hope that we can continue to improve our working relationship on those aspects and make sure that that communication comes early, so that we have sufficient time to prepare the legislation for this type of hearing. I want to thank the members who participated today remotely, and the members especially who have introduced legislation that will continue to benefit our veterans and help provide them benefits that they deserve for their service. I'd like to thank the VA and the National Cemetery Administration for participating, as well as our VSOs. Thank you for being part of this important conversation, for your ongoing support to our veterans, and we will continue to work in a bipartisan way to make sure that we can get this legislation that will benefit our veterans move forward and signed into law in the future. So thank you.